A machine can now read 3,000 years of Egyptian writing faster than any human scholar alive, and it is currently working its way through a backlog of untranslated inscriptions so large that most of it has never been read by anyone since the priests who carved it. Before you assume the story is about the Rosetta Stone itself, it is not, because the Rosetta Stone was fully decoded 2 centuries ago, and what it actually says is almost painfully ordinary. The real story is stranger than that. It is about what artificial intelligence is now, surfacing from the thousands of other Egyptian texts that never got the same level of attention, and some of what has come out of that process is genuinely unsettling. Stick with me for the next few minutes because I'm going to walk you through exactly how this technology works, what it has actually found, and why some of the oldest surviving writing on Earth turns out to be a lot darker than most people assume. And if you want more real investigations built on documented evidence rather than invented mystery, hit subscribe now, because that is the only kind of story this channel tells. Let's start by clearing up the Rosetta Stone itself, because getting this part right actually makes the rest of the story more interesting, not less. The stone was carved in 196 BC and rediscovered by French soldiers near the town of Rosetta in 1799. It carries the same official decree written 3 times, once in Egyptian hieroglyphs, once in Egyptian Demotic script, and once in ancient Greek, which meant scholars who could already read Greek finally had a way to work backward and crack the hieroglyphic system that had been unreadable for well over 1,000 years. A British polymath named Thomas Young made the first real breakthroughs in the 1810s, correctly identifying that some hieroglyphic symbols represented sounds rather than pure pictures. Then, in 1822, a French scholar named Jean-François Champollion, who had been obsessively studying Egyptian language since childhood, finally cracked the full system, proving that hieroglyphic writing combined phonetic sounds with symbolic ideas in a much more sophisticated way than anyone had previously assumed. That breakthrough is genuinely one of the great achievements in the history of linguistics. And what the decree on the stone itself actually says, once you translate it, is almost anticlimactic. It is a formal statement issued by a council of priests honoring the young pharaoh Ptolemy V, praising his generosity toward temples, confirming tax exemptions for priesthoods, and ordering that copies of the decree be displayed in temples across Egypt. No curse, no hidden warning, no secret code, just fairly standard ancient political messaging, the kind of thing a government today might put on a plaque. So if the Rosetta Stone itself holds no dark secret, where does the unsettling part of this story actually come from? It comes from everything else, because here is something most people do not realize. Cracking hieroglyphics in 1822 did not mean every Egyptian inscription immediately got translated. Egypt produced an almost unimaginable volume of written material over roughly 3,000 years of recorded history, tomb walls, temple inscriptions, papyrus scrolls, funerary texts, administrative records, personal letters, medical texts, magical spells, and legal documents. Translating hieroglyphic and hieratic script by hand is slow, painstaking work that requires years of specialized training, and even after 2 centuries of professional Egyptology, a genuinely enormous portion of surviving Egyptian writing has never been fully translated, cataloged, or even read closely by a trained scholar. Entire storerooms and museums around the world hold papyrus fragments that have simply been sitting there, photographed but not translated, because there are far more surviving texts than there are Egyptologists with the time to work through them one inscription at a time. That backlog is exactly where artificial intelligence has started to make a genuine difference, and it happened faster than most people expected. Over just the past few years, several serious research efforts have applied modern machine learning techniques directly to the problem of reading ancient Egyptian at scale. Google's Arts and Culture division launched a project called Fabricius, specifically to help both professional researchers and the general public work with hieroglyphic text using machine learning-assisted translation tools. Academic teams have gone further, building what researchers call hieroglyphic transformer models, the same underlying technology behind modern language AI, specifically trained to translate ancient Egyptian text directly into modern languages, rather than requiring a human expert to manually work through each symbol. Other research groups have built systems combining computer vision with translation models, allowing a camera pointed at a wall of hieroglyphs to identify individual symbols, reconstruct damaged or partially eroded sections based on patterns learned from thousands of other inscriptions, and produce a working translation in seconds rather than the weeks or months traditional manual translation might require. One independently developed app, built by an Egyptian computer science graduate and a small team of Egyptology experts, can now translate hieroglyphs on a museum wall in real time simply by pointing a phone camera at them, instantly converting 3,000-year-old writing into modern language on screen. What makes this genuinely significant, rather than just a neat piece of software, is what these tools do to the sheer scale of what can be translated. A single trained Egyptologist working carefully might translate a modest number of substantial inscriptions across an entire career, cross-referencing damaged or ambiguous symbols against known vocabulary and grammar built up through decades of comparative scholarship. A trained AI model, once properly validated against known translations, can process thousands of inscriptions in the time it takes a human scholar to work through a handful. That does not mean the AI replaces expert judgment. Ancient Egyptian grammar is genuinely complex. Symbols can carry different meanings depending on context. Damaged inscriptions often require educated guesswork that still benefits enormously from human expertise, and every serious research team working in this space has been careful to describe these tools as accelerating and assisting scholarship, rather than replacing it outright. But even functioning purely as a research accelerator, this technology has meaningfully increased how much previously unexamined Egyptian text is finally getting read, cataloged, and cross-referenced against everything else known about the ancient world. And this is where the story actually gets dark, because as more of this previously untranslated material has been processed and cross-referenced at scale, it has reinforced something Egyptologists already knew in fragments, but rarely gets much attention outside academic circles. A significant portion of ancient Egyptian writing is considerably more unsettling than the sanitized golden sarcophagus version of ancient Egypt most people grew up picturing. Take the Execration Texts, a genuine and well-documented category of ancient Egyptian writing. These were formal curse inscriptions, often written on pottery or small clay figurines representing named enemies of the Egyptian state, foreign rulers, rebellious officials, or entire hostile nations. The ritual itself involved writing the enemy's name directly onto the object, and then smashing it, sometimes burying the broken pieces, sometimes burning them, as a form of symbolic magical warfare intended to bring about the enemy's downfall through ritual destruction rather than military force. Archaeologists have recovered substantial caches of these broken execration objects, and cross-referencing the names inscribed on them against known historical records has given historians real insight into who Egypt considered its most serious threats during specific periods, essentially reconstructing an ancient enemies list written in the language of ritual violence rather than diplomacy. Then there is what Egyptologists call the Cannibal Hymn, a genuinely startling text carved into the walls of certain Old Kingdom pyramids, describing the deceased pharaoh in the afterlife, hunting down, capturing, and ritually consuming other gods in order to absorb their power and authority. The imagery is graphic and deliberately unsettling even by the standards of ancient religious literature, describing the king's servants rounding up the gods like cattle for slaughter, with detailed, almost gleeful language about the process of consumption. Egyptologists generally interpret this as symbolic religious poetry about a pharaoh absorbing divine power to secure his position in the afterlife rather than literal doctrine. But the text itself does not read as gentle symbolism. It reads as genuinely disturbing ritual literature, and it has been sitting on pyramid walls for over 4,000 years. Medical texts add another layer of unease, not because they contain anything supernatural, but because of what they reveal about how genuinely difficult daily survival could be. Surviving Egyptian medical papyri contain treatments for injuries, illnesses, and complications in childbirth, described in language that makes clear how limited ancient medical understanding actually was, alongside remedies that mixed genuinely useful practical knowledge. Some wound treatments show real anatomical understanding, with remedies rooted in magic and superstition that offered patients little more than false hope dressed up as medicine. Reading these texts at scale, rather than in the small, curated excerpts usually shown to the public, paints a picture of ancient daily life considerably harder and more precarious than the monumental temple architecture and golden funerary masks tend to suggest. Perhaps the most quietly unsettling category, though, involves ordinary administrative and legal records, the kind of material that rarely gets any public attention because it lacks the visual drama of a cursed tomb inscription, but which AI translation tools have been particularly effective at processing simply because there is so much of it. Tax records, court proceedings, labor rosters from massive state construction projects. These documents, once translated and cross-referenced at scale, reveal a rigid, often brutal system of forced labor obligations, harsh legal punishments for even minor infractions, and a society considerably more stratified, and for most ordinary people, considerably harder than popular imagination typically pictures when thinking about the era of the pharaohs. None of this is secret or newly discovered in the sense of being previously unknown to specialists. Egyptologists have understood the broader outlines of ancient Egyptian labor and legal systems for a long time. What AI-assisted translation is doing is making the sheer scale and specificity of that historical record accessible far faster than manual translation ever could, turning scattered fragments into a much more complete and considerably grimmer composite picture. It helps to understand a little more about how these translation models actually work. since the mechanics are genuinely clever and explain why they have gotten so much better so quickly. Most of these systems are built the same general way. Modern AI language tools are built by training on large volumes of paired examples, in this case, pairing images or transcriptions of hieroglyphic and hieratic symbols against verified human translations that Egyptologists have already produced over the past 2 centuries. Feed a model enough of those paired examples, tens of thousands of individually translated symbols, phrases, and full inscriptions, and it starts learning the underlying statistical patterns of the language itself, which symbols tend to follow, which others, how grammar shifts depending on whether a text is religious, administrative, or personal, and how certain symbols function differently depending on their position within a phrase. Some of the more advanced systems also incorporate computer vision models, trained specifically to recognize hieroglyphic symbols, even when they are partially eroded, cracked, or worn down by thousands of years of exposure, essentially teaching the software to make the same kind of educated reconstruction a human expert would make when looking at a damaged inscription, based on which symbols most commonly appear in that particular grammatical position. None of this happened overnight. Researchers spent years building and refining the underlying training data, digitizing existing scholarly translations, standardizing symbol classification systems, and testing early models against known texts to measure how accurately they performed before trusting them with genuinely unexamined material. That patient, unglamorous groundwork is exactly why this technology only became reliable enough for serious use in the last few years, even though the basic idea of applying computational methods to hieroglyphics has actually been discussed by researchers for decades longer than most people realize. It is also worth sitting for a moment with just how much translation work Champollion and his early successors managed to accomplish using nothing but painstaking manual comparison, because it makes the current AI-assisted backlog feel even more significant by contrast. Champollion did not have access to any of the massive comparative databases modern Egyptologists take for granted. He worked primarily from the Rosetta Stone itself, from a handful of other bilingual inscriptions that had surfaced by the early 1820s, and from his own considerable knowledge of Coptic, the later form of the Egyptian language still used in Christian liturgy, which gave him a crucial linguistic bridge back toward understanding how the ancient language actually sounded and functioned grammatically. Building an entire working translation system essentially by hand, cross-referencing symbol by symbol against a handful of known texts, took him the better part of 2 decades of dedicated, often frustrating work, and he died just a few years after finally publishing his breakthrough, worn down by the sheer intensity of the effort. Everything that followed after him, generations of Egyptologists slowly expanding the known vocabulary, refining the grammar and translating text by careful text, built directly on that original foundation. What AI-assisted translation is now doing is taking 2 centuries of accumulated scholarly groundwork, all of that vocabulary, all of that grammatical understanding, all of those verified translations, and using it as training material to finally catch up on everything that individual human scholars never had the career-length hours to get through on their own. Not because overselling this kind of technology does a disservice to the genuinely impressive work researchers are doing. These models are not making dramatic new discoveries in the sense of uncovering some previously unknown ancient conspiracy. What they are doing is something more valuable in the long run, radically speeding up access to material that was always there, always technically knowable, but functionally locked away behind the sheer time cost of manual translation. Every text described here, the execration curses, the Cannibal Hymn, the harsh legal and labor records, has been known to specialists for decades, or in some cases, well over a century. What has changed is how quickly and how broadly that material can now be processed, cross-referenced, and made accessible to researchers and the public alike, and that shift in scale is genuinely significant even without any single sensational new discovery attached to it. There is also a legitimate scientific caution worth raising here, the same kind any careful researcher would apply to a new tool being used on historically sensitive material. Machine translation models trained on ancient languages can make mistakes, particularly with damaged inscriptions, ambiguous grammar, or symbols that carry different meanings depending on regional and historical context. Serious research teams working in this space have consistently emphasized that these tools work best as a first pass, flagging likely translations and freeing up expert time to focus on the genuinely difficult or ambiguous cases, rather than functioning as a fully autonomous replacement for trained Egyptological judgment. A translation confidently produced by an algorithm is not automatically a correct translation, and the researchers building these systems have generally been careful to say so themselves. This matters especially for a language like ancient Egyptian, where the same symbol can function as a sound, a determinative marking the category of a word, or a standalone idea depending entirely on where it sits in a sentence, a level of contextual complexity that still occasionally trips up even carefully trained models, which is exactly why human oversight remains a permanent part of the process, rather than a temporary bridge until the technology improves further. What makes this story worth telling honestly, rather than dressing it up with an invented conspiracy, is that the real version is already compelling enough on its own. A society that built some of the most awe-inspiring monuments in human history also produced curse rituals meant to magically destroy its enemies. Religious poetry describing gods being hunted and consumed, medical texts revealing how fragile daily survival actually was, and legal records showing a rigid, often harsh system that ordinary people lived under for their entire lives. None of that requires artificial intelligence to have secretly decoded some hidden message inside the Rosetta Stone. It only requires giving researchers a faster way to finally read everything else that ancient Egypt actually left behind, material that was sitting in museum archives the whole time, simply waiting for someone or something with enough patience and processing power to get through it. So the real revelation here is not a single terrifying secret buried in one famous artifact. It is the accumulated weight of thousands of ordinary texts, finally read at scale, revealing that ancient Egyptian civilization was considerably more complex, more violent in places, and more difficult to live in than the polished museum version most people grew up with. If you had to guess which category of newly accessible text says the most about what daily life in ancient Egypt was actually like, the ritual curses, the religious poetry, the medical records, or the legal system, drop your take in the comments, because after 2 centuries of translation and a new generation of tools finally catching up on the backlog, an informed guess grounded in the real evidence still beats another invented headline. If you want more stories built entirely on documented history and genuine research rather than exaggerated claims dressed up as breaking news, subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications, because there's a lot more of this kind of investigation still worth digging into properly. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.